Hi, and welcome to Death is a Living Process, our second webcast in the Death and Dying Wisdom webinar series. I'm Deb Halloran, here with my co-producer and moderator Mel McMurrin. This webinar series is inspired by the wisdom of Avatar Adidam Samraj, as found in his book, Easy Death. 3 speakers join us today: Angelo Druder, Judy Wendling, and Rachel Kuhn. Angelo will begin talking about the stages of death and their relationship to the cycle of reactivity in life. He will conclude with a 10-minute video clip of Adidam on serving a dying person and essential instructions on entering the death process. Judy will join him to answer your questions. And then we have a story from Rachel about serving her disabled mother's life and death process, informed by the wisdom and influence of Adidam. Let's begin. Angelo Druder has been teaching the Easy Death seminar around the world for over 2 decades. As a devotee of Avatar Adidam Samraj since 1975, he has served many people in the dying process. He's also the author of the Tao of Rejuvenation, as well as many articles on health, rejuvenation, and serving the dying. Welcome, Angelo.
Thank you, Deb. And welcome everybody to Death is a Living Process. Many people today are familiar with the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Elizabeth, in several groundbreaking anthropological studies, showed us what was actually happening in the room when Westerners died. And we discovered that for the most part, everybody, the person who is dying, those serving that person, the survivors, everybody was in reaction to the process. Elizabeth observed and described the reactive cycle that human beings dramatized in the face of death. And this reactive cycle, now called the stages of death, sometimes referred to as the stages of grief, have become a part of the conventional wisdom of our time. Most people are now familiar with the process of denial, anger, betrayal, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Let's consider this cycle. Let's consider these so-called stages of death for a moment here. Denial. Denial is non-feeling, unconsciousness. We inherit our death in the moment of our birth. And this death inheritance, the stress of mortality, is the fundamental stress in the human heart, and we carry this stress over all the roads of our lives. And the fundamental human strategy for dealing with this death stress, with the stress of mortality, is denial. We try not to think about it. We presume that when death takes place, it will take place so far in the future, it doesn't pertain to us in this moment. This is denial. Try not to think about it. In denial, the being is not yet ready to observe reality as it is and deal with it. Anger, betrayal, we all know about anger and betrayal. In anger and betrayal, we're beginning to see what is actually occurring, and we do not like it at all. Anger and betrayal is a great reactive fire in the human body. The life force in the kidneys, the life force in the liver rises up and reacts, attempting to push away the pain that we're experiencing, push away and change what is actually occurring. My father, who had been a calm, steady presence over the course of his life, I always remember my father calmly handling the crises as they occurred, serving people. But as he approached his own death process, he became enraged. And he was still well, but he was breaking down. And the process of degeneration had really begun in his case. And he became full of anger, and he felt utterly betrayed to such a degree that he became a very threatening presence. And he was even locked up for a 24-hour period at one point. And we spoke. After this, we spoke in the morning when he was released. And I asked him, I said, did you get your lesson about anger and betrayal? Do you see where this energy leads us? And he did. And this time of being incarcerated for my father was actually very graceful in his case. It truly served him in understanding something about the destructiveness of anger and betrayal. So in my family, we've added a stage to the stages of death. We've added the arrested stage. Bargaining. We live in a capitalist society. We live in a world that's fundamentally a capitalist Western world. We're in trouble. We'll negotiate. We'll make a deal. This is bargaining. There is a wonderful movie that depicts bargaining in the face of death. It's called The End. It stars Burt Reynolds. In the movie, Burt is diagnosed with a terminal disease, and he decides to end it even earlier than the disease would end it. And Burt decides to drown himself, so he swims out from shore. And then, as he actually begins to drown, he decides he doesn't want to die at this point. And he begins to bargain with God. God, this is Bert as he's beginning to drown. God, if you can just get me back to shore, I'll live the 10 Commandments. God, if you get me back to shore, I will tithe 50% of my income every month to your church. I'm talking 50% of the gross, God. And then the current starts to bring Bert back into shore. And he's beginning to see the possibility of being saved on shore again. And he says, God, like I say, I will tithe 20% of the net. And finally, Bert is washed ashore again. And he says, I'm not paying any money to the church. You almost drowned me. This is bargaining. The movie is called The End. Depression. In depression, the life force collapses back in on itself into a condition of non-feeling. And finally, acceptance. The people come to a point, people approaching the death process come to a point of acceptance. And in acceptance, we're not talking about the ultimate enlightened condition. We're mostly talking about people come to a point of resignation with what is actually happening. These are the so-called stages of death. Avatar Adidam Samraj concurs with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. He says, yes, people do animate this reactive cycle as they approach the death process. But he clarifies the root of the matter. He says, not only do people dramatize this reactive cycle as they approach the death process, people dramatize this reactive cycle right from the moment of our birth. This is the very reactive cycle of beings who feel mortal, of beings who feel separate, and threatened. Avatara Adidam tells us that this is the very reactive cycle of egoity itself. What is egoity? Egoity is the sense of being a separate self, a separate something. At its root, egoity, the sense of separateness, is just a mere pre-verbal sensation of relatedness, being something over against something else. At its root, egoity is just this mere pre-verbal sense of relatedness. At the surface, it is this reactive cycle, this reactive fire which is constantly rising and falling. If you want to see the kind of a world that beings create who are dramatizing this reactive cycle of denial, betrayal, anger, betrayal, bargaining, depression, acceptance, turn on the news tonight and you will see the kind of world created by people who are dramatizing this reactive cycle of egoity. At the root of egoity is the emotion of fear. My dictionary defines fear as the emotion of dread brought on by a sense of threat. There is this emotion of dread. And something feels threatened. Avatara Adidam explains that when this fear is present, this sensation of being a separate self is an error in consciousness. It is an error in inherent conscious light, which is fundamentally bright and free and love blissful, but through the action of egoity, through the contraction of the being, human beings fail to enjoy our inherent prior condition, love, blissful, conscious light, full of peace, full of happiness. The fundamental work, therefore, for human beings, the fundamental work in the death process, is the transcendence of this reactive cycle and the communion with inherent happiness, inherent love, blissfulness, love, infinite existence. It is our true condition. But the separate self-sense created by egoity, the agitation of this reactive cycle, prevents us from enjoying what is fundamentally happy and free. Therefore, the ultimate work of human beings in the death process is the transcendence of this reactive cycle and the communion with this inherent happy, love, blissful condition. This is the work, the fundamental work to be done in the death process. This is the fundamental work to be done in the life process. This is Avatara Adidam speaking in Easy Death. Listen to this. It must become obvious to you what takes place after death. It must become obvious to you what takes place after death. This certainty comes only when you permit yourself to feel and experience and fully live the spiritual process. Then you will be certain of your present condition, and the phenomena around you will begin to become transparent. Their true condition will begin to become obvious to you, and the reality of death will begin to become obvious. But if you remain reactive and ego-possessed, you will never have any certainty about the death process. You will be full of doubt, and you will suspect that death is final. You will not have a living relationship to everything. Then if you see someone dead, you will not be alive to that person. You will not still be in the feeling relationship to him or her. And thus you will not be aware of his or her present existence. In that case, you are dead yourself.